We've got sign-in sheets if you haven't done that. They're in the back of the room, as well as a bunch of different handouts, including agenda. And on the back of the agenda has a map of the locations of the 9 zones within our 5-county region. Restrooms out the door to the right, down towards the end of the hall. We got coffee and water here for refreshments. So feel free to, if you need to get up and stretch, you just go right ahead and get up and stretch. I think to get the ball rolling, perhaps we'll just go around the room and do introductions so everybody knows who everybody is and try to facilitate some networking. I'm Jordan Zeller. I do economic development at the East Central Regional Development Commission.
I'm Melissa Hansen. I'm the president of the North Span Group, and we do community consulting and work with economic developers across the state and the upper Midwest.
I'm Jessica Deegan. I work with the State Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. I director of federal affairs there.
Matt Hegernus, business account specialist, East Central Energy.
Joe Cronin, City of Malacca Economic Development Commission Chair.
Greg Bergman, I'm with the Small Business Development Centers out at Central Lakes College.
Mike Wimmer, Malacca County.
Joe Tapp, First National Bank of Malacca.
Rashawn Wilson, First National Bank of Malacca.
Marshall Lynn, City of Malacca.
And I'm Carla Vida. I'm with the City of North Branch, and we are the ones taping this event, so hopefully it'll be electronic, so Jordan can give it to you, and you can link to this to your websites if you choose to.
Well, to get the ball rolling, on the agenda, we've got 3 presenters today. The first one, first presentation is kind of Opportunity Zones 101, everything you always wanted to know but were too afraid to ask. Kind of a general overview of who, what, where, when, why, and how. And as you'll hear, opportunity zones really have 2 big benefit areas. One is commercial industrial, and the second is multifamily housing. So for Minnesota Housing, we've got our second speaker here today to talk about what kind of programs they have available to help make deals more apt to happen. And then I'll clean up on this one today and talk a little bit about what kind of resources are out there for not only housing but business development inside our 5-county regions. So with that, I will turn it over to Alyssa Hansen. She is the president, chief cook, and bottle washer of the North Span Group, and here today to talk a little bit about opportunity zones and how they can work for you.
Awesome, thank you. Just based on the size of the group and that we're already in the circle, I'll probably sit and converse with you instead of going back and forth. So there's 2 flyers over there I want to call your attention to before I start because I will forget. And that is one that talks about the Minnesota Opportunity Collaborative, which I'll explain a little bit more in detail towards the end of the presentation. And another one that's about this thing called the Challenge, which is being put on by the collaborative along with a lot of partners across the state. It's to try to get projects to start talking about what they're doing and actually to provide assistance to projects that would win this challenge that's out there. Happening here in June and July, and it provides a lot of expert advice to them, not from us, but actually from accountants and legal and investment firms that are working on this in the Minneapolis area. So I just did not want to forget because I knew I would. So, what are opportunity zones? I'm sure there's a varying level of knowledge as to what this is, but basically, it's a tax incentive. So it's not necessarily a program that's been created at the state level. It's actually a federal tax incentive that was created during the Opportunities Act in 2017. And one of the ideas around why this was created, not sitting in the legislature, this is what I gleaned, and working with LISC and other national organizations, is that it's really about the unrealized capital gains that a lot of folks have with high net worth that are looking to invest, but sometimes don't know where, sometimes don't invest, and we're starting to see more of a renaissance in investing locally where they live. So why now? Primarily, this was targeted at these lower to income communities, distressed communities, and in those communities, there are fewer jobs and businesses in 2015 than there were in 2000. So we've seen kind of a disinvestment in those communities. The new business formation in those communities has had a 6% So there's just nothing kind of sparking attention in those communities. And then in the growth that we've seen across the nation, the majority of the growth has happened in 5 large metro areas. So New York, San Francisco, et cetera. So we're not seeing the regular growth that we had seen in prior years in our more rural communities and even just across more states in general. So some of the intended social impacts, which I'm sure you've heard of, but why I think it's important that we're talking about this with our communities and really kind of getting the ball rolling is that it is a federal incentive, so it's been hard to kind of figure out where does this land and who tries to make it happen and what does that look like, and each state's a little bit different. But ultimately, why we're out talking to people and why this group of folks is saying, hey, what is this and how do we use it, is because we want to see social impact. So the hope is to see job creation in those communities, affordable, attainable housing, and then to revitalize the communities that they're in. So then what is a zone? You know, like what really are they? So they were created in low-income housing census tracts. So when you look at those maps, you're like, why is it cut off half of our town? Or it's hard to figure out why, and it's actually been a really tough discussion, and it's done differently in different states. Actually, in Minnesota, I think it was one of the more proactive ways to get communities involved, and that the governor said apply it together in your community and tell us what census tracts you think it makes the most sense in. Or like in Wisconsin, the governor just said this is where they're going. So there wasn't a lot of community conversation around where they went or why those tracts were chosen. And so they may be in places where one won't see investment because who knows, it might be marshland and zoning doesn't even allow for it, or other bummer kind of situations. And we saw some of that in Minnesota, but communities were pretty proactive in trying to bring forward tracts that they thought would make sense in. So that's how it was done in Minnesota. So if you're trying to figure out why the tracts are chosen, you probably have to talk to either the city or the county in the area that you're in. In the US, there were 8,762 tracts that were designated. And in that area, we'll talk about this at Minnesota level, they did some research, and in that area there's 24 million jobs and 1.6 businesses currently, or million businesses in those tracts. So a lot of potential opportunity. It's not like there's nothing in these tracts, which a lot of people think, and probably everyone here knows that's not true. Out of that 1,800 were rural, which is what most of the tracts, over half the tracts actually in Minnesota are rural communities instead of in Minneapolis and St. Paul. The average poverty rate in those tracts is 31%, unemployment 14.5%, and the average family income, the AMI is 60. So pretty low income tracts, out of that 8,700, almost 2,000 in that rural area. In Minnesota, there were 128 designated tracts. There, as you saw in Jordan's map, there's a lot of them in East Central, there's a lot in Northeast. There in Southwest, there's a lot. They really are spread apart, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. 78 of the zones are in greater Minnesota, and 50 of them are in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So out of that, same type of research, just a quick snap, 487,000 people live in those 128 zones. So clearly, the bulk of that population is in the two zones or the census tracts in the Twin Cities. 540,000 jobs and about 32,000 businesses. These are the 81 communities that those zones are in. So you probably recognize some of the cities, and it is really widespread. So trying to make sure communities know what they have, what that tool is, and how to work with businesses who might be looking at expanding and finding those investors. It feels, I think it feels like a couple steps away from the regular economic development that a lot of communities are used to. And so a little tougher to figure out how do we do this, and almost why is it spread so everywhere, but also good that it is. So then what is an opportunity fund? A fund is just an investment vehicle that's required to utilize this incentive. They have to actually create a corporation or a partnership. And it's basically a self-certification process. We'll talk about the two types of funds, but they're required to invest 90% of the equity into that zone area. So there's actually some leeway with where that other 10% goes. New regulations just came out last week, and so I'm not like 100% solid on them, but they're also in like a, you can comment on them if you want right now, period of time, again. And then the property that they can own is stock, partnership interest, or actual business property. So there are some, like Jordan was talking about, that are what feel a lot more tangible than, you know, stock in a business partnership. How do you measure kind of the basis of where that's at to the requirement that is to grow? That's some of the new rules that are just coming out right now. So the two different types of funds that can be created. So say you have someone, a business owner maybe, that's looking at a large expansion and they want to just create their own fund. They could create a single asset fund for their project, work with their accountant and their attorneys, never talk to anyone other than figure out how to do it themselves to get equity partners into that project. Or if they were putting in all the equity themselves, they could do it that way too. Often we don't see that, but that is a possibility. And then there's multi-asset funds. So this is what you're hearing about, like these are just being created all over the nation right now. In the state of Minnesota, we only have a few that have come out publicly. The Dream Fund is probably the most recognized. That's the Minnesota Opportunity Zone Advisors group. The fund that they created, it's separate from their organization, but, and they're really looking at housing and real estate projects more than anything. But they are looking at projects. And then, so like with the single asset, I have a example when we get down here in a little bit about that, where it could be one really big project. You know, generally you're seeing the conversation happening with a project that's at least 6 figures. So you have to be able to invest a certain amount, which we'll talk about for it to qualify. So it's generally going to be a fairly large project. It's not going to be just like a storefront remodel or some of the other smaller projects. When we might see that there are other economic development tools that probably would work way better. So next, I guess, and this is what a fund is, and why would people want to use this tool? They could do a 1031 exchange. If you don't know what that is, Google it. But it's basically where you can sell something and put that capital gain right into something else and not pay taxes on it. So why do this instead of that if you've got those types of assets? Well, there's 3 main reasons. You can get a temporary deferral on the capital gains that you would have from like a current project that you might be selling that asset, so you don't pay any taxes currently. You defer those all the way through that 10-year time frame, 2026. Then you actually get a reduction. You reduce the taxes you owe up to 15% after 7 years. So not only do you get to defer it out that 10 years if you keep the funds in it that full time, but you actually get a reduction. So you won't pay the original amount that you would have had due. And then you would pay 0 taxes on any dollars that were gained on that investment while your dollars were invested in it. So in the perfect world, there's a 10%, you know, gain on that project. So you put it, you know, build a project for $300,000, I'm totally making this up, and it's worth 10% more, and you would normally pay capital gains on that value if you sold it after that 10 years. You would pay no capital gains tax on that if it was part of an Opportunity Zone Fund project. So there can be a serious tax impact, positive, for someone that's willing to look at these types of projects. The timeline for them is that investors have to, so if it's a multi-asset, like we were just talking about, or if it's a single asset, once it's been identified and they create that gain, they have to invest within 180 days. So say you've got this project and you're gonna sell this building and now you have this capital gain, it was cash, you have to invest it within 180 days into one of those funds for it to qualify. And then, like I said before, and I'm still getting better at these slides, so you're gonna hear this 90% thing like 4 times. you have to keep a 90% of that fund's assets in the zone. And it has to get in the zone within 6 months. So there's all kinds of different ways investors know how to move money around, and this is the rule that makes them move it around in that format. And then you have to, in a real estate investment, you have to substantially improve that. I'll talk about what that means just on the next slide. And to get that maximum benefit that we were just talking about, they really have to invest in 2019. Now they're looking already at how they're gonna extend past those 10 years, much like what happened with Job Z, if people are familiar with that. We had this incentive for a little while. It spurs a lot of development, people are pumped about it, and then the government's like, hey, this seems like it might work and be a good idea. So they're already talking about extending that out, which would be great because when these rules come out and the 10-year was 2026, well, it's 2019 already, and so in another year, people start to lose that, that deferral that they could get. And so there's already starts to be a disincentive and people are just kind of figuring out still the rules. Haven't even fully been checked by the federal government. So some of those are the technical issues, right? The one I wanted to briefly touch on is that substantial rehabilitation. So this is what I think we will probably see the most of. Let's say it's a housing project or a commercial development, mixed use. If it's a redevelopment project, a little easier if there's nothing on the site, but say you have a $400,000 estimated value site, building and land, and the land is worth $100,000. The land does not count, and that must be substantially rehabbed, but that $300,000 does count. So when you're done with the project, the new value has to be double that. So it has to be $600,000 or more. So it's actually kind of simple once you understand those little bits, but that's what that means. If you're doing a real estate project, if the estimated market value is 0 and there's no land there, it's a little easier because you're just doing a new project. But in rehab, which is I think what we'll probably see a lot of, because in most of these tracks, there's buildings to be rehabbed. So it's taking that current market value and then it has to be doubled minus the land. And then 70% of that tangible property that's owned by the business also has to be in that zone. So really, there are some rules set up to help the what we might call local business, or a business that might have 4 or 5 locations, but 70% of that business's owned or leased property has to be within that zone. So you're not gonna necessarily probably see a franchise business utilizing this tool, because if they're owner of a franchise and they have 10 locations, 1/10 most likely of it's gonna be in that zone. So it's gonna more than likely be a mixed use type building where you've got housing, or a manufacturing business where that's their main location. Maybe they have 2 or 3, but this is where all of their administrative offices and stuff like that are. So there are some kind of slims down the types of businesses that could use the tool. So eligible investments. Whoop, it's a funny little thing there. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. So investments in real estate is the easiest. That's pretty much what I've talked about for the most part. The new equipment and other assets, this is really interesting, especially if you have a business that is looking at spending a lot on manufacturing equipment. For instance, a new brewery. The building might not be a huge investment, but the stainless steel inside could easily be a large part of that project. They could actually, the equity investor could buy that equipment and lease it to the business. So just like you would have a business that owns their building and they lease their building from themselves, similar situation. So they could own the equipment as part of equity investment into the company, then the company could be leasing it back. So they start to see some return on investment right away. So just learning more, that's one of the newer pieces that's just coming out, is, you know, like how do you invest in a business versus a building, which is a lot easier to just kind of tangibly understand. And same with, on the left, the business investment, that's like a stock issuance. This is the one that I have to admit I know the least about, or how it would function. And that's the part where, you know, trying to figure out how do you take a baseline? They've just kind of started to say what it would be. So is it gross revenue is here, and at the end of this period of time, it has to be here, and that's how you've proven that your equity investment grew the business a certain amount. So I don't think that I'm gonna see a lot of that happening on the front end. In our communities, I wouldn't be surprised if that's some of those projects that are single asset, people do on their own, because they've got really savvy people like Baker Tilly that they're working with on their accounting, and they know how to use this tool. I don't think we'll see as many of those happening in our communities, or we will, but we won't actually know they're happening. So investors in opportunity zones, it could be banks, could be corporations, individuals, partnerships, and there's this social impact investor movement that we're hearing more and more about, and that's really what I like to say is your local people. They're the ones that walk on your streets and they're trying to figure out how to invest their dollars. They're most likely gonna be looking at some of those multi-asset funds, but that they're gonna require that fund invest in the communities they live in. And this is a really nice, we've been working with Cogent out of the cities. They do a lot of work around impact investing. I think that this kind of explains what that is. So you have foundations and organizations that do grants and some venture philanthropy. And then you have, you know, traditional investing, what we might call more responsible, where you're paying attention to more versus just, you know, it's just out there and the dollars are doing its thing. And then you get into this impact investing where that person might, or group of people might live in that community. They want to focus on and see housing projects happen that are mixed income or even low income. And that would be where you're gonna have, you know, less of an ROI compared to traditional, but you're also not giving it away for free. So this is something we're learning a lot about right now. We haven't seen a ton of it in our communities, I would say, but it's definitely picking up. And we're seeing just in, I live in Duluth, and we've had one successful project that I'll talk about for 2 seconds in a minute. And I would say that that really is an impact investment, even though it's a multi-asset fund that would traditionally not kind of think about it that way. But because the communities are saying what they want to see happen, you know, it's like if you can continue to put it out there that you want to see downtown look different, well, it might. It's like you start to get lucky in economic development sometimes. So impact investing is just it's an investment strategy that seeks to create both positive financial return. They don't want to lose their money. They would like to, you know, make a gain, but also have some social or environmental impact. Lots of times you'll see cleanup happening with those projects in brownfields. And they're trying to actively measure if that project, if they invest in that project, has it made a difference in the community? That's definitely new, I think, in the economic development world. For a person who invests regularly in their savvy, they probably are measuring that themselves. I don't ever want to say that an investor wouldn't be doing that. You just don't know about it. And so I think this will start to bubble up, and we'll actually know more about what our investors are choosing to invest in our communities. This slide really just talks about some of the things that we're hearing, like why wouldn't investors do this? And they're just generally a higher risk for the return. You're not going to get that traditional higher return ROI. There are timing issues in that 10-year hold, and if that's going to extend, and a variety of other things. And then on the deal structure side, it's just different. You know, are they looking for straight equity? Do they want to have a leveraged portfolio with that project? So this is just kind of a snapshot of some of the things we've been hearing. We're trying to learn more about and really help not only the projects that are trying to happen, but the communities talk about what they want to see. It's almost like having a prospectus from a financial firm as a community and saying, this is what we want to see in our community. Pay, invest here, even if we don't have projects in hand. So we'll get into some examples. Now this is, again, why. Why would that investor want to do this? Because they can do a 1031 exchange or keep all their money in traditional. And this is what the federal government came up with that's so smart. So traditionally, if you had that capital gain, 100,000, and kind of went through the regular rigmarole, sold it, had some appreciation, your available dollars after tax would be about 168,000. And if you invested that 100,000 in an opportunity zone fund, you have zero tax payable on the front end, so that 100,000 goes right in. And if you sell it for that 259, basically the same. You know what you could sell it for that price. Zero tax on appreciation, and you get to defer that tax up to 24% if it stays in the project through 2026. The after-tax fund available is significantly larger on the same exact investment. So this is why I think we will see them, but how can we help them happen in our communities on projects that we hope to see happen? So some examples, talked about this a little bit, just in economic development, infrastructure, seeding some new businesses, private equity, enhancement for other programs, which is why Jessica's here, but new markets tax credits, historic tax credits. We're seeing tax increment being used in congruence with this because there's still, redevelopment issues that those programs can couple with. So we've talked about this a little bit, but this is, the issues to consider on that substantial rehab, what of the income needs to be in that, what of the assets needs to be in that, and so it does narrow the businesses that can really use the tool from an economic development standpoint. Now, this is a new piece that I was talking about that I don't know very well yet, but I got it in here, and I know Jordan's gonna share this with you, but if it's a gross income, this is how they're talking about that. The three main criteria is that 50% of those services have to happen there, 50% of those services by the employees, and then the tangible property has to be within that. So they're still not quite explaining what's the base of the business to figure out how it's measured, but getting a little more to it. In housing, some of the examples, pairing this with those other tools, workforce rental, and I'm curious to see if we will see kind of a lease to own or more single family ownership coming out of that versus just rental. I think rental is the simplest, but we of course really love to see more home ownership. We're still learning how that will look. And in the affordable housing pieces, some kind of, the project risk return is an issue just because if you don't couple the right incentives, there's not a lot of ROI, and so harder to find that investment purpose other than their original capital gains that they might be investing. Can never forget about that. And then requirements that might come around those dollars. A good example, a real live example, this is the first single asset, and there are just two more that have announced in St. Paul, Minneapolis area, but in Duluth, the 333 Tower, there's currently 3 little buildings sitting on this site. It's where the Voyager Inn Motel is. If anybody's ever seen that, it's like the best spot for grandmas. So I feel bad for those folks, but it's the same owner that owns that building. And 2 other buildings that have been sitting empty for over 10 years. Just really, and then right next to the Sheraton. So it's like Sheraton and a couple other really great developments, and then this weird swath of land in Duluth. So it is a $75 billion project, 15 stories with 200 residential units. Those are more market rate, but they are lower than some of the other market rate in Duluth. So there's this conversation about, in Duluth, obviously, what's market rate? Can I afford it or my neighbor afford it? What's market rate? So we have some fairly, what I'd call high end, that are considered market rate. So the piece of this that I think is more of an impact is they're looking at having urban grocery and possibly childcare in that first few floors. That's a huge need in the community. And so how are they coupling these services with housing? Really, I think that's what I'm hoping we see more of in other communities, that the developer's listening to what the community need is, and they know they're gonna be able to rent that space out. And so that is really cool. Piece of that, it's also connected through the Skywalk. They're adding connections to all the health and a St. Luke's and Essentia around there. And so my guess is they're hoping to get some employees that are renting those units. And they are doing major digging and ground, so there is over $6 million in TIF that the city is coupling with this fund. They have been working with Baker Tilly and I believe Springstead too before that merger came. So they have a single project fund, but this same group of investors that is doing this project is looking at investments all across Minnesota. So they haven't come out as strong as the Dream Fund, but I expect them to. So they're Madison and Chicago and Minnesota group of folks that really want to start investing in more of our rural communities and have said at many events now that without this concept, they probably wouldn't have done it because it just, like ROI just wasn't there, and now it is. So it's refreshing to hear that because I think you just never know if you're going to or if a tool like this will be utilized in anywhere other than some of our larger, nationally very large communities. So first Minnesota success story, and they break ground very soon. Okay, so the next 3 slides, I'm not going to talk through this one. That's just key points. You can read it again if you want. But some of the strengths. So really from a community perspective, the work that Norspan does with businesses and communities and economic developers, what's cool about this is that we did in Minnesota have local strength and choosing where those tracks are. And so there's a little more buy-in. The communities are trying to figure out how to use this tool, how to partner with state programs, local programs. There is some flexibility. It's not just housing and it's not just mixed use or just manufacturing, but trying to figure out what the flexibility means is still a little muddy. That this is a new group of people to invest in what I traditionally call community development. That is really, to me, the most interesting and exciting piece of this. That we would have private sector capital going into a low-income area that maybe traditionally has seen disinvestment, and that they're starting to communicate about how actually excited to invest in the communities they lived in or grew up in. And straightforward, relatively, compared to some of the other programs that deal with taxes. You can just work with your tax attorney, and the individual businesses don't have to work through city council meetings or county board meetings or any of that if they don't utilize regional or local tools. So it is technically, I would say, more straightforward. Doesn't mean it's not hard to figure out if you don't have a professional that knows how to do your taxes really, really well. So concerns from a community development perspective is that it's not a local incentive, and so there feels like there's a lack of oversight. But I don't know, I have owned 3 or 4 small businesses myself, so lack of oversight can be a concern and an advantage. Depends on your tax attorney and making sure you do your taxes at the end of the year correctly. The lack of impact incentives. So a lot of what I think is discussed is, just like I have, is the back end return. You know, you have to keep your money in there, and so there's less focus on what is the impact in the community and how do we measure that. We're working with Cogen, like I talked about, and LISC at a national level, as well as in the cities and in Duluth. They do work in the rural communities in Oakville, that's where their offices are. And they're trying to figure out, and they're working towards kind of a framework to almost score projects in Minnesota on what is the social impact of that project, so that the communities can talk about, like I said in Duluth, like, okay, just another housing project, great. They're not really paying attention to the fact that we need mixed income. This is what, you know, you're hearing, versus being able to put it through kind of a little systematic measurement tool and say, actually, if they do urban grocery and have childcare, and here's what their rents are compared to the other, there is some serious social impact. And so those investors have had a really hard time. They've had to go to city council meetings. And we feel like if that tool existed for our communities, it might get investors or project developers to talk about their projects more openly versus feeling a little scared all the time to bring it to city council because it just feels like another market rate project to if you've been to a city council meeting, to most of the folks that show up to city council meetings. So we're really trying to educate our public on what these projects can be for the communities. So, how are we doing? Okay. So this is my two minutes. I want to talk about the collaborative. So this group of people I've been talking about that are working with us, we are called the Minnesota Opportunity Collaborative. And what we're pulling together is trying to get out and speak with different groups in the state to talk about this and just really inform people so that they can ask questions. We're looking at having a monthly web conference call, so people can just call in, hear about what the newest rules are, what's going on. Our focus is economic developers, bankers, anyone that would touch a project, developers, so that they can just listen and add and ask. That's the collaboration. There is a directory of all the projects and sites that is live now that people are trying to get investment for in Minnesota. So we're working with DEED on how to kind of figure out where that should live because they don't want to do it. And we said this group really wants to do it because we know if at a national level, the investors that are out there see what Minnesota's trying to do, we might actually gain investment that we traditionally have not in the state of Minnesota from other investors across the nation. And then awareness and education. So not only doing something where we are collaborating and listening to each other once a month, but just getting out there and as far and wide as we can. I'm working with a few other people that are trying to get to communities to talk about this. So I'm not gonna skip over that. So really trying to inspire investment in our communities, and don't wait for the perfect developer to come, but start figuring out what are the tools, what are the assets I have in my community. This is kind of the 201, so I'm not gonna go into it, but I am gonna skip ahead to this because you have Jordan and GPS in this area that is working hard on sharing education and knowledge and marketing the community, trying to kind of put together what is the community prospectus and what do we want to see in East Central. So if you're trying to figure out projects or learn from each other, don't forget about these two groups that you have right here. They know how to reach me if they have questions, and I would be happy to take questions now or later, but that's the end of my spiel. Yes?
Does the investment into the opportunity zone have to come from a capital gain, or can it just be
It
strictly
doesn't.
cash investment, and then when you sell it in 10 years, it's tax-free?
Correct. Yeah, it doesn't have to come from a capital gain, but you just obviously wouldn't get that deferral on those capital gains, but
Right,
you'd still get.
But you don't pay tax on
Right, on that
new
whole
gain.
gain. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's gonna be for, obviously I can't predict the future, but my guess is the ROI isn't gonna be as large
Mhm.
compared to other projects that could be invested in, but yeah, you would pay zero on the gains on that project if you just put in cash or, equity in some form on the front end. Yes.
When it comes to project sizes, what's kind of the magic number for making it worthwhile? Because the fees and the paperwork and all that stuff, is there a minimum project size? And then inversely, you sold your stock in Microsoft or whatever, and you're going to invest. I mean, is it worth throwing 10,000 worth of capital gains in, or is it, where's that tipping point? What are we looking, really looking at for pure benefit?
What I've seen so far is that projects are in the couples of millions, not necessarily tens. The 333 is a large project, but there are other ones that we're seeing where, like the Dream Fund has gotten pretty engaged that are 4 to 6 million. So you could probably imagine 10 to 30% of that is they're trying to get an equity raise. So it's definitely not like the must-be massive project. It's focused in rural communities. Most of our rural communities are probably not gonna see a $70 million downtown project, but 4 million, 6 million, 8 million, absolutely. And then, what was the second part of your question?
For individual investors, how
Yeah.
much is the minimum, kind of?
I think, well, that depends too on so I've been hearing more and more about a lot of people wanting to just invest, say like they have sold their Netflix stock and they've got 30 grand. Well, they have to be, you still have to be a qualified investor or working with a multi-asset type fund that can qualify you in that way. So it would be whatever their minimums are to be part of that fund. So I know that that varies depending on the investor kind of group that you're working with.
So once you make the decision to put it into a fund, you're locked into the 7 or 10 years. You can't get out after 2 or 3.
Well, what's so interesting about it is no, you wouldn't be locked in, but it would depend on the agreement you have with that business for your equity. So you know, just like any other equity investment in this, if you keep your dollars in there for that full period, you're getting the best reward from the program. That doesn't mean you couldn't just take part of that reward from the program and be bought out over 5 years if that was what that business was hoping to do. So I think that you'll see kind of the regular business deals, equity invested, they're looking to get you out. I would say though, typically in a smaller projects, ones that I've seen or even be part of, 5 to 10 years is a typical, either you're part owner in the business or they want, you know, they're trying to buy you out. So it's pretty rare that the business would have the ability to buy you out in a couple years, you know, just with cash flow.
Any other questions?
Hand it over to Jessica.
And should you think of something, on the agenda is Alyssa's telephone number and email address, and I'm sure you'd be happy to field phone calls or emails from folks if they've got any questions or
Absolutely. I
want
left
to
cards
brainstorm.
back there too if you want to grab. Pretty and they're new, so I just want to hand them to everyone.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Alyssa.
thank you. Yes.
Here we
Yep.
go.
The down clicker moves it forward.
Here we are.
Sort of, sort of not. All right, I'm gonna sit down.
And knowing that housing is a huge issue here in East Central Minnesota, and that housing is one of the projects that could benefit from opportunity zones, we've invited Jessica Deegan here. She is with Minnesota Housing. So with that, Jessica, thank you.
Thank you. I think before I get started, I'd like to have a sense of who's doing housing development in the room from any kind of step along the way, whether it be multifamily or single family. Is there developers and investors? Okay, good. So before I get into some of the tools that we have available that could really pair well with opportunity zone investments, I'll take a little bit of a step back. I won't cover Opportunity Zones 101, Alyssa did that really well. I want to talk about where we were at with the state in this designation process and how that worked in a little more detail. Because like many, we were surprised by this in the tax bill, and we were also very surprised that the governors were asked to start this designation process before there were any rules for the program out there. So it's a little bit like the horse was before the apple cart, certainly. And so when we started reaching out and talking with communities, so we at Minnesota Housing partnered with DEED, Department of Employment and Economic Development, to do this process. And so when we started reaching out to communities across the state, there was a lot of question, well, what is it? What benefit would it have? And so we were really trying to figure out where and how to prioritize these tracks. So we at the state just sort of generally believe that zones should have outcomes that encourage long-term private capital investment in these urban and rural communities, and that investments should really transform the communities because they, by definition, are low income. They've seen disinvestment, as we saw with some of the data. So how can these investments really benefit those communities? And then how can we engage in this equity investment that would ensure that outcomes are positive for the communities? So that's sort of our higher level thoughts about it. And so when we went through and talked with communities, our principles of selection were really, hey, what do you need in the community? What are the needs of the low-income census tracts in your community? How can these investments or picking these tracts help to further equity and inclusion across the state? Because of the time crunch really that we're facing with the zones, what's ready to go? What sorts of developments in the zones were ready to go? Are there development possibilities? Engagement was also another big priority for communities if they were reaching out and talking with others. And we really did have a great process across the state. We also wanted to know what investment potential was and that potential positive impact that I talked about a little bit more. And so we knew right away that we couldn't just sit at the state in St. Paul and make these decisions. I didn't know Wisconsin did that.
Yeah.
So that's
It's tough.
no, it is tough, and it's sort of tough either way because you just put that decision making without a lot of knowledge in somebody else's hands. So at the beginning, we had 509 census tracts across the state that could have been chosen, and these are, again, by definition, low-income tracts with higher poverty than the rest of the state. We, at the outset, kind of brought that down to the lowest income of those 509 to 250 tracts, and then sent out to counties, all cities of the first class, and tribal communities, and asked them to prioritize the census tracts that were eligible for designation in their community. And so we asked folks to rank their tracts into priority 1 and 2 and 3. And ultimately, what happened was we found that the communities, everybody's first choice, it sort of worked out really well, that county. So all counties provided applications, cities and tribal entities, and their first choice, their first ranked tracts together were about 128, and so that worked out really well for us. We made sure they all worked and sort of fit those priorities, but it's partially why you see this real patchwork of tracts across the state is because generally every county has one. There's a couple that don't. And so it's a little bit random. Some state really focused on doing it all more clustered in areas, but this provides opportunity in the rest of the more rural areas, which I think some communities wouldn't get. So we, Governor Dayton made the recommendation to Treasury, so now we've got these official recommendations coming up on a year that we've had them, and so there's been a lot of what's next after the state did that. In terms of the designation process here in East Central, I mentioned, so all the counties and the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe sent in their prioritization, and just a couple quotes from their applications. I went through them all, and I think what really struck me during this process is the amount of support and passion that folks have for their local communities. So in Kennebec County, private investment is needed to create jobs within the county, so workers don't need to commute. So we have this sense, particularly in this region, of bringing jobs in and closer, so we get to cut down that commute time. And also that there really is a lack of affordable housing throughout the county there. In Isanti, there was a little bit more of a focus on business parks. So that was where they were focusing on more job creation and that side of things. So we did see this mix of people focusing on housing, people focusing on jobs and workforce development and that kind of thing, but the general consensus is how can we lift the community. Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe talked a lot about creating partnerships. And one partnership that they brought to our attention was the Lady Luck Estates housing development that we've invested in and bringing together that combination. And that would be in a zone, of course it's already down the pipe and won't get opportunity zone investment, but it's an example, and they really talked a lot about partnerships. So these are where the 9 census tracts are, as we've seen on the map, and then across the state as we've seen as well. Just a little bit more detail on what these tracts look like in Minnesota. We talked about that half of them are rural and that 10% of Minnesota lives in one of these zones. Generally speaking, the opportunity zones versus the rest of the tracts, they are, of course, by definition, higher poverty and lower income. And they're also more racially and ethnically diverse than state averages, and also generally much younger than state averages. And that's particularly because they're in the urban communities, they're in younger areas. But in rural areas, they're generally in more job growth areas. Unemployment rate's pretty similar in these tracts from the rest of the state. And I will say that on average, there's 64,000 jobs within 5 miles. higher in the metro, but it's significantly higher than the sort of looking at census tracts overall. And so there are more opportunities for jobs nearby. These are areas that would benefit from that investment in that way. One thing also to note, which gets to the substantial rehab question, is that both rental and single-family homes within these zones are much older than statewide averages, so that rehabilitation of key infrastructure is pretty key. So I want to talk really about what our programs are that could pair with well. We have, on the multifamily rental side, we're the primary allocator of the low-income housing tax credit. We talked about that as being a tax incentive that could pair well with this. So we have, it's a very competitive process. We are typically able to fund about 1 in 4 applications that come every year, but really this is how affordable multifamily development is getting done right now. And our biggest barrier with the opportunity zones in terms of providing incentive in that program for opportunity zones is when we draft our qualified allocation plan, which is a requirement of the federal government, we do it 2 years in advance. So we're right now this spring doing an RFP that includes our low-income housing tax credit that is for the tax credits in 2021. And so we already start going down this timeline, and we have to go through substantial public comment to get incentives in this plan and that sort of thing. So really when it comes to the tax credit program for housing, it's all about the leverage. And so if a developer comes in that already has committed qualified opportunity fund investment in their deal, it would count towards leverage in our application, and leverage is really key in getting an application funded. So while it's not overtly prioritizing housing investments in qualified or in opportunity zones, it would benefit them greatly to come in with that kind of funding. One program we do have that we have a little more ability to be quick on our feet with is a new state program called the Workforce Housing Development Program. In fact, DEED had it last year. Strange for DEED to be in the housing development business. They passed it over to Minnesota Housing last year, and we did our first RFP, and we have a second RFP that's out right now. And this is geared towards market rate, really that 80% AMI to 120% AMI, so above our tax credit levels, non-subsidized housing development in multifamily. And cities in greater Minnesota are able to apply for this, and developers work through the city in that case. But this is a program, because we don't have that long leg time like our qualified allocation plan, that we this year in our July RFP are going to be able to prioritize opportunity zones. So folks in cities coming in looking to get and take advantage of this workforce housing development program, if they're able to pinpoint locations within an opportunity zone, they'll get a bump. And I don't know exactly what that will be, but it will be significant. So, and I think we've often thought that the opportunity zone investments make a little bit more sense on the market rate and the sort of this more, what we call the missing middle, which is tax credit income limits of 60% of area median income up to about 120% of area median income, where it's really difficult to find anybody who can do that kind of investment without substantial investment from a subsidy perspective. So those are our main multifamily programs that I think would pair well. We do have other multifamily investments and streams of funding that would work well in the same way that our low-income housing tax credit does. They'll get a similar priority if they're coming in with funds. And then on the single-family side, we have been thinking too, how can we be creative about doing more large-scale single-family development projects that would help to get up to the level of what this kind of investment is. So we, this year, for an RFP that just opened for communities to come in, so typically we get applications from cities or nonprofits to do single-family housing programs, and that's through our impact fund. It's a state-funded program that they will be incentivizing investments in opportunity zones, or just sort of prioritizing programs coming in that are thinking about it and considering how they can work with those kind of other investments. So that's what we're doing on the housing side. I wish I had all the programs. I don't work for Deed, but they have a lot of programs for business development that would pair well, but I think they're similarly positioned where they don't have overt incentives to invest in an opportunity zone in their programs quite yet. So those are things we're working on. I do want to show this map. So these are the opportunity zones in the region, and then what the colors of the tracks represent is in our current tax credit qualified allocation plan, we have geographic priorities. So in greater Minnesota here, if you have like a good dial-a-ride situation, you get some points geographically. If your schools are above average, you have certain points. So there's a lot of geographic-based incentives. So these darker blue tracks are those that already point really highly in our qualified allocation plan, and the yellow represents those that point pretty low, under 10 points for those geographic priority areas. So this shows a range of 1 to 26 points for our geographic areas. A total application is about 100 points. This represents about a quarter of the points. And given how competitive the program is, sometimes 1 or 2 points really makes a huge difference. And so these areas that are blue in this region are those that are going to attract the tax credit investors from that perspective. And so I know we've seen lots of projects recently, North Branch and otherwise, that and Malacca is a blue as well. So I just wanted to show that to say some of these census tracts are already pretty competitive from that perspective, should housing developers be considered. And just wanted to show some of our recent housing investments. I thought we had, these were loans that were closed, but we had some recent selections in North Branch. But I see there's a few in there. All really across the region, we've had 13 multifamily loans that have closed in the last 8 years. We had another project funded last year, 2 others that I know that aren't on this map that will be closing in the next year. So there's a lot of activity, and I think it could be accelerated if investors are coming in with some of this opportunity fund investment. So that's where we're at from the housing state perspective. Happy to answer any questions or get you in touch with folks if you know of developers who are interested in these programs and would like to get some technical assistance or things like that.
Any questions for Jessica? Again, her contact info's on the agenda sheet, so please, that's right there too, so please don't hesitate to contact her. Thank you. All right. Now's your chance to escape before I talk. You laugh, it's true. All right. Well, everything I'm going to go through today is in our regional business assistance directory. Many of you have seen that. I've dropped it off of your office. Some of you are listed in there by name. So a variety of different resources available. Most of these will pair very nicely with opportunity zones, and they do, it's like, remember National Lampoon's Vacation. I don't know why they call it Hamburger Helper. It does just fine by itself. So some great programs. Sorry. Greg's laughing. He knows what I'm talking about. So some great programs that are available to help whether standalone or in partnership with an opportunity zone. So feel free, if you don't have a directory, to grab one if you haven't already done that. This directory is on our website. It's updated periodically as we find out about more programs. So what you see today, you may be a little bit different than what you see next month. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what we call gap lending. Gap lending is oversimplified. Say you've got a business with a $100,000 project. They're going to start a business. They're in business, but they need to buy some new equipment or do a little expansion or whatever. So we're not a bank. We don't pretend to be a bank. We don't want to be a bank. We send you to a bank. The bank says we'll lend you $60,000. The owner reaches in their pocket. They've only got 10. They're still 30 short. Most of these are programs that'll come in, take a second security position. If it's an SBA program, might even take a third position to make the deal happen if it's going to do good things in the community, which is typically retain jobs, create some new jobs, and grow the tax base. And say this project is bigger than $100,000, say we multiply it times 10, now we have a gap of $300,000. $300,000 is probably more than most of these loan programs can lend. However, we're pretty good at blowing the bugle, getting a multitude of folks around the table and trying to put together a financing package that will make the project happen. So the first one is where I work, of course, the East Central Regional Development. We cover all 5 of the counties in East Central Minnesota: Chisago, Isanti, Kanabec, Mille Lacs, and Pine. Most programs in our region cover all 5. Some will only cover 1, 2, or 3. So just know that going into it. Also, the Entrepreneur Fund covers the northern part of our county, Kanabec, Mille Lacs, and Pine. They're based out of Duluth and the Iron Range, but they've been slowly expanding over the past couple of years into our region, and have already partnered on several loans. The Initiative Foundation as well covers all 5 of our region, counties in our region, and they play very nice with others in the sandbox. I do want to mention for those that some banks do SBA loans, some banks do not. There's several nonprofit lenders who will partner with banks to do an SBA loan. There's Minnesota Business Finance Corp. They're based out of St. Cloud. There's also SPEDCO, which is actually on the next page. But they play very well with others as well. Mentioned several times in here, DEED, the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. They have a variety of lending programs, loans for veterans. The best deal around, I used to be a lender at DEED, 0% interest, no payments for the first 18 months, 4 years of principal, repayments after that. Best deal out there. They do bigger projects. Their lending limit typically is $1 million without the legislature getting involved. And the local unit of government plays intermediary. It's a sweep project, or a sweep program, where the money comes from the state to the city, or the county, or the township, whoever, local unit of government. They lend it to the business. The local unit of government gets to keep up to $100,000 to start their own loan fund to loan the project A and B and C down the street for future projects in town. So it's a great program there. Kyle Jordan, if you're in the south part of our region, is your loan officer. Brad Brzezinski, if you're from the north part of the region. NCEDA, the North Central EDA, also has a micro loan program. I think, Greg, are you on their loan board?
No.
Nope, I thought you were.
They kicked me off.
They kicked you off for good behavior or what?
Yeah.
So they do micro loan programs. Our power co-ops do some great stuff. I see we've got a gentleman here from East Central Energy, and their parent, Great River Energy, has some great programs available to assist as well on that. First Children's Finance should be a child care center. That's what they specialize in, notoriously tough to finance. So they've got some great programs there. For female entrepreneurs, we've got 2 great programs in our region. We have Women Venture, which covers the south part, and the Women's Business Alliance through the Entrepreneur Fund cover the north part of our region. A few other folks out there, Community Reinvestment Fund, CRF, does lending. USDA Rural Development, you don't really think of USDA doing financing for businesses, but it's true. I have a college buddy who financed his radio stations through USDA Rural Development. Who would have thought it? I'm in the business and I didn't think of that. So some great programs. Another newer, unique program is called PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy. If you're looking at rehabbing a existing building, they can come in and finance basically anything that's energy efficient, the HVAC, the insulation, windows, etc., and got some great interest rates and some programs on that as well. Going through, I'll touch a little bit. We already talked about opportunity zones here today. We keep a pretty good database of equity investors, so should you be looking for equity investment in a project, feel free to give me a call. I'm happy to make referrals. Most of those folks don't want their names out in public, but happy to visit with you about that. We also have opportunity for foreign trade zones. So if you're working with a business that's doing importing and exporting, either out of the Port of Duluth Superior or the MSP foreign trade zone, can help with some duties and tariff relief on that type of program. Some co-working and business incubator spaces, I won't get too far into that. The important part here I want to talk now is about technical assistance. We've got a variety of programs available to help with know-how and how to work the system and how to connect you to the resources. The first one, the big one, is the Minnesota Small Business Development Center. And their services are free of charge. In our part of the world, we're covered by 2 regions. Greg Bergman is here. He's the regional Papa Smurf for the North Central group, and then Barry Kirchhoff from the Small Business Development Center in St. Cloud covers basically Malacca and South Pease and Princeton in our part of the world. Heidi Steinmetz is the counselor for Kanabec County as well. What they specialize in is basically what I would say, getting it out of your head onto paper and into banker talk, help with business plans, financial projections, loan packaging, putting that together. Besides that, they've got a wide network of counselors. They can help with marketing plans. Some folks are turnaround specialists for business. So no problem too big or too small. If they don't have the counselor in their office, they'll refer you to someone who can help. So we're broken down geographically. Chisago County has Nancy Hoffman. Isanti, Mille Lacs, and Pine has Tom Willett, and Kanabec County has Heidi here in the room. A few other programs I'll let you know. Legal Corps. Any lawyers in the room? Good, I can tell the joke. No. Apparently every lawyer is supposed to give so many hours pro bono on the house. And Legal Corps is a central clearinghouse. They work with a variety of basically IDS center law firms, very specialized stuff. If you're looking for help putting together an LLC, a corporation, some of that kind of basic paperwork, generally most of your small town lawyers can do that. If you're looking for somebody who specializes in intellectual property or dealing with foreign countries, more specialized stuff, that's what they excel in, and they're either absolutely free of charge or very low cost. So some great programs with Legal Corps. If it's anything dealing with agriculture or food, AURI, Agricultural Utilization Research Institute, can help. One of the projects they tell me about, they specialize in, if you're trying to get grandma's salsa recipe out on the store shelves, they can help you figure out so much sodium, so many calories, all that kind of stuff, all those labels. So a wonderful program there. A variety of technical assistance programs from the Entrepreneur Fund, including their Women's Business Alliance. They're looking at putting together an event in Princeton this fall after school gets going again, focused on female entrepreneurs. When that gets announced, I'll make sure everybody knows about that as well. But some great programs for female entrepreneurs, same with Women Venture. Explore Minnesota Tourism, pretty much what it sounds like. We also have some great, very great colleges in our region, Pine Technical Community College and Anoka Ramsey. Both work very well with businesses for customized training and specialized programs like that. Also a variety of programs for businesses that are A, looking to export, or B, trying to attract foreign investment in. Minnesota Trade Office runs a point on that. Also U.S. Commercial Services does some great programs there. The Workforce Center, Central Minnesota Jobs and Training, should you be looking to hire employees or looking for a job yourself, great resource there. They're also very versed at what kind of grants are out there to help businesses. Dolly, Department of Labor and Industry up there, they were just presenting actually in this room at our city administrator meeting a few months ago that Tammy hosted. They've got up to $6,000 per year per employee for 4 years in targeted industries for help. So basically, if you've got an IT person, you can send them back for a master's degree and they'll pick up the tab for it. Pretty cool. So hospitals and banks are the big users of that because they have IT and HIPAA and all the security kind of stuff. SCORE, if you're not familiar with that, it's a great organization. Very similar to what SBDC does, but more on the mentorship. These are retired executives that used to work for Honeywell or 3M or whatever big business. They've been there, they've seen it, and they can free mentorship one-on-one and kind of help you through those hurdles. I would also, if you're looking at doing projects, whether it's housing or business, to talk to your local units of government, your city, your county, or your township. We've got those listed here. But they have a variety of programs. Some cities and counties have loan programs or can be your intermediary in programs like DEED with the Minnesota Investment Fund or things like that. They also have a variety of other technical assistance and financing programs that can help. So they're all listed there. And then of course our elected officials higher up the food chain, our state legislators and our congressional delegation. And again, these are in our business assistance directory. It's available on our website. We also have paper copies back there. So that's kind of the Reader's Digest condensed version. As always, I know I've talked to many of you over the phone. I'm happy to sit down, visit with you one-on-one. You tell me the problem and we'll try to connect you to the resources that can help on that. But that's the long and the short of it, my friends. Any questions for me? All right, hearing none. Oh,
Quick question.
darn me. Didn't
You
shut
know,
him up.
Melissa, do you know if the 504 folks are on board with opportunity zone funds being used as, found as equity for their projects?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that.
I haven't heard no. We should ask, Tim or somebody at MBFC because it's still just equity. So I can't imagine why not.
Good question.
You'd think, they'd have that, would have said that from federal
Sure.
government, like, yes, use this, but no, that
Yeah.
hasn't happened.
You
I'm
know,
aware of.
you kind of talked about that 10-year time frame
Mhm.
where investors would probably want to get out. And,
Right.
that might be a sticking point. But,
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like your personal guaranteeing on a 504 as well as an equity investor, because you're gonna be required if you're investing,
sure.
20% or 30% of the project. Or how they would do that with fund versus a single asset.
Right.
That would be the hard part, probably. They probably wouldn't, I don't know. On a multi-asset fund, like, for instance, if the 330 was a little bit smaller and they were doing 504, how would they do that if they could? Because you've got a multi-asset fund that's investing in it. I don't know, we'd have to ask. Wonder if they've thought about that yet. Have to ask
I'm sure
Spedco
some-
and MBFC
I'm
if
sure
they're
somebody
figuring,
has.
if they're thinking about it, yeah.
Exactly. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to Tammy for hosting us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
If you can't get enough of this, we're gonna be in Pine City tonight at 6:30, so, please feel free to come on over to that one as well. But thank you again, and thanks to our speakers, and, safe travels.